In this lesson, we're going to discuss creating, saving, and opening documents. If you'd like to follow along, first we're going to change our defaults. So hit Command-K on a Mac or Control-K on a PC. And we're going to go into units and increments. And we're going to change from the default picas to inches because all of my measurements for this lesson are in inches. So for horizontal, I'm going to make it inches, and also for vertical, and then I'm going to click OK. Why don't we start by setting up a brand new document? If you go to File, New, Document, you'll get the New Document dialog window. Before we do anything, I just wanted to say that not all of the settings may be shown in your dialog window. You'll see that there's a little disclosure arrow next to bleed and slug. If I click on that, you can't see what's in that section, and bleed can be very important. So let me click on the little disclosure arrow to reveal bleed and slug. Now let's go through the various settings. I'm going to start with intent. What is the intent of the document that we're creating? By default, it's print. But if I click down on the intent pop-up, I can choose web. If I wanted to create, let's say, an interactive Acrobat for the web, or digital publishing, if I wanted to create folios for the iPad. I'm going to stay with print. Number of pages. Well, the first question I have is, does InDesign have any limitations as to what number of pages or what size you can make a document, how big the margins can be, or the bleed? Well, usually the way I'll find out what the limitations are of InDesign is to ask it to do something that's impossible. Like, for instance, number of pages. If I make it 0, all I have to do to find out the limitations of InDesign is to click in some other field. And it's going to give me an error message. The value must be between 1 and 9,999. Well, that would be a pretty big InDesign document. But let me just click OK, and you'll see that it goes back to the default 1. Now, what are facing pages? Anytime you want to design in spreads, you're going to check facing pages. This will allow you to design master pages that have a left and a right page. We'll get more into that in an upcoming lesson. But getting back to limitations, I wonder if there's any limitation to the size of the documents. Let me just do this. Instead of the default letter size, and you can see there's a bunch of other possible preset sizes that are here. I'm going to change the size. Let's see if there are any limitations. I'm going to make the width 0, and then click in the height, and it says the value must be between 0.0139 inches and 216 square inches. That is huge. So if I need to design some sort of a billboard that's 18 feet by 18 feet, I can do that at actual size in InDesign. Let me just click OK to get out of this warning. And it goes back to the default 8.5 inches in the width. Well, what if I wanted the horizontal page that was still 8.5 by 11? Well, all I have to do is click on landscape for orientation, and it switches around the width and the height. I'm going to go back to portrait. Now, if I knew that I was going to be using columns, I could set up column guides right here. So if I click my up arrow next to number of columns, I'm going to go to 2 columns, and I can also specify the size of the gutter between those columns. But unless I have a primary text frame as part of this document, it's only going to put in column guides. If I have a primary text frame, it will actually divide that frame up into columns. What is a primary text frame? Well, if I wanted a text frame on a master page that would get repeated on every single page that has that master applied, I would choose primary text frame, and it will make the text flow from page to page to page from master text frame to master text frame on each page. I'm not going to check that for this particular document. Now, what about my margins? Well, by default, they're 1/2 inch. And by default, they are also linked together. So if I change just, let's say, the top, it's going to change all of them. If I wanted to change only, let's say, the bottom, I would have to click on the little link. So the settings are not going to be the same. And then I can change just the bottom. Let me go back to the default 1/2 inch. Now, what about bleed? What is bleed, first of all? Anytime you're going to print something on a printing press that needs to go to the trim, to the outside edge of your page, it has to go a little bit further just to be safe. So when it gets cut, after it's printed on a cutting machine, you don't end up with a slither of white going down, let's say, the right side of your page. It would not be a good thing. So having a bleed of 1/8 of an inch has become fairly standard throughout the printing industry. But some people use a bleed of up to 1/2 inch. And in some cases, you may need a bleed of 6 inches, like for a banner of certain kinds. So you always have to check with your printer to make sure that you have enough bleed if anything needs to go right to the edge of your page when it gets cut. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the top bleed field, and on my keyboard I'm going to hit the up arrow twice. For each time I hit the up arrow, it goes to the next available 1/16 of an inch. So if I click my up arrow twice, I get 1/8 of an inch bleed all the way around, which is fairly standard. Now we're going to get to the term that seems to cause the most issues with people because they don't have a clue what slug is. I can tell you first of all what a slug is not in this particular case. It is not a slow-moving snail, and it is also not a punch in the face. Anytime you need to add objects outside of your trim, which may need to print at certain times, you would add a slug area for those objects. And when you go to print, you can choose to print the objects in your slug area. So it only prints when you need it. Things like information about an ad, which advertising agency created it, what magazine it's running in what issue, and who the contact person is at the advertising agency. So you're only going to want that in a proof. You're not going to want that to print in the actual magazine. So you can choose to print it for the proof. Now, one last thing before we move on. I'm going to click Preview. This will give me a preview of all of the settings that I've actually just specified in this dialog box. And if I know that I'm going to be using these settings again and again, like let's say this was for a magazine ad, well, I'm going to want to save that so I don't have to set it up again. I could save it as a document preset simply by clicking the Save Document Preset button. It will add it to the pop-up for document preset, so it's always going to be there every time I need to set up new documents. Now, all I have to do is click OK, and there's the document we just set up. Well, what about saving documents? It's actually pretty easy. All you have to do is go to File, Save As, and it's going to give you a dialog. You can name the file, and you can also choose a format for the file. You can tell that my particular version is actually Creative Cloud, so it's an InDesign Creative Cloud document. And if I click down on that, you can see that I can also save my layout as a template. If you say something as a template, let me just do that. You can see it has a different suffix at the end. It's actually INDT. And templates are really kind of nice because what you can do is save a basic design. Open that basic design by going to File, Open, and then continue from there. So if I have a newsletter that I'm saving, I could save it as a template, and then every time I'm creating a new issue, instead of starting from scratch, I can start from a template. So a lot of the work will already be done, with the basic format of my newsletter. So that's kind of a cool thing. Besides InDesign template, there's also something called InDesign CS4 or later. It used to be to back save to an earlier version of InDesign. You had to go to File Export and choose IDML. You can still do that, but now for the first time, you can actually go to File, Save As, and choose InDesign CS4 or later IDML. And you can open an IDML file in CS4 or later. But a word of caution, if you're using new features in this new version of InDesign, you're going to have problems if you save it all the way back to CS4 because the new features will not work. So you do have to use some caution when backsaving. We'll be talking more about IDML files when we get to export in a later lesson. Now, let me just cancel this and we're going to talk about the fastest way to open a document. Now, I'm going to close this new document that we just set up just so I have a blank area in the middle. And you'll remember earlier I talked about application frame if you're working on a Mac. If I go into my window menu, you can see that I have application frame checked. That's the reason I can't see my desktop. It made the entire window into one piece. So I can't see what's on my desktop, but also if I were to resize this area just by going to an edge or a corner and clicking and dragging inward, it would resize as a unit. But getting back to what's the fastest way to open a document? Well, if you don't have any documents open and you're using application frame on a Mac, on a PC, it doesn't matter. It always is using application frame. It's just the way a PC is. And if I double click on the blank area, it's going to go to File Open. And I can choose the file to open. Let me just hit Cancel. But I can also go to the more standard File Open or Command O on a Mac or Control O on a PC. And I'm going to select a file. I'm just going to choose any file. And you can see down the bottom, there's something called Open Normal. There's also something called Open Original. Let's talk about the difference between those two. If you're working with templates, it's the only time that the difference becomes obvious. Open Normal will open a template as an untitled document. Open Original, if I were to click on that, it's going to open the original of the template so I can make changes to the template itself. If I were to choose Open Copy, it would open a copy of the original document so I don't mess up the original. And then all I have to do is navigate to the file that I want to open and click Open. And it's going to open that document. We're going to continue talking about layouts in the next lesson.